Welcome back to the Aubergine Chef. Now today we'll be making a Dobos Torte. Now Dobos Torte originated in Hungary by a man named Joseph Dobos, and he invented it sometime in the late 1800s, around 1884. And basically he created this cake because it was a way to preserve, the method that he used was a way to preserve cake back then when they didn't have a lot of access to refrigeration and this and the other, or any access to refrigeration. The top layer is covered with caramel, which helps keep it fresh, keep the cake nice and fresh. And his cake was made with buttercream, which wasn't really that common in that time. Most of the icings back then were made with like whipped cream and such, so they would spoil really quickly. By using caramel and buttercream, he was able to create a cake that was shelf stable for the time. Now I've taken some liberties with the recipe. I'm actually going to fill the cake with ganache and then ice the outside layer with chocolate Swiss buttercream. So that way it's a little bit more richer in chocolate. Why don't we just go ahead and get started. Now this Dobos Torte recipe is a great recipe to add to your menu if you are a baker or a home baker, because it doesn't require any extra special ingredients. All the ingredients you should already have at home. So on the mixer, I've got 12 ounces of unsalted butter at room temperature. With that, I have 12 ounces of granulated sugar, about a gram of salt, just a pinch of salt, 4 grams or about a teaspoon of vanilla extract, and that's all in the mixer. And then in this measuring cup, I've got about 6 eggs. If you can get them to room temperature, do so. It helps make them helps make it easier for them to get incorporated into the mixture. And then I have here 12 ounces of sifted all-purpose flour. Now the original recipe calls for half and half of it to be pastry flour and half of it to be cake flour. So about 6 ounces of cake flour, 6 ounces of pastry flour. That's going to make a fluffier, more tender product that's going to absorb water a little bit better. But most people don't have those flours on hand, and I don't want you to go out and buy flour just for this recipe, and then you're just going to have it rot in your pantry. I don't want that. So just go ahead and use all-purpose flour. So why don't we go over to the mixer, and we're going to beat our sugar and butter and vanilla extract and salt until it's light and fluffy. Okay, once your butter, your sugar, your salt, and your vanilla extract are all nice and mixed together, we're going to go ahead and add in our eggs. Now, I went ahead and slightly beat them a little bit with a fork, and we're just going to add them in a little bit at a time until they're incorporated. And depending on how much of this you make, so there's a double batch in the recipe, for example. If you make a double batch, it could take up to 15 minutes to incorporate them all. So take your time when you're incorporating your eggs. Okay, so after about 15 minutes or so, your mixture should look light, velvety, creamy. It should lose that separated texture, and this is why it's very important to use room temperature eggs, because it can have a very separated, curdled look if you don't use room temperature eggs. Now, if you use cold eggs and it's not coming together, or if it's just not coming together for one reason or another, you can use a creme brulee torch to warm up the outside of your bowl, if it's a stainless steel bowl, and that'll help warm up the process so everything comes together a little bit faster. It could still have a curdled look appearance like mine does, but it'll look a lot more smooth and velvety than when it starts out. Okay, scrape down the sides of your bowl, including the bottom, to make sure there's no egg or sugar stuck to the bottom. Then go ahead and put in all your sifted all-purpose flour. Remember, this is 12 ounces. And just mix this together until it comes together. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and finish this off by hand. And the reason we're doing this is because we want to make sure all the ingredients are nice and mixed together and there's nothing stuck to the bottom of the bowl. Okay, now I forgot to mention this in the beginning of the video, but this is one of the very first things you should do, other than preheating your oven to about 380 to 410 degrees. You want to prepare your sheet pans, and to do that, you want to have 2 sheet pans sitting inside of each other. That is, if you think your oven has a lot of hot spots and your cookies, for example, burn on the bottom really quickly. Mine does, so that's why I'm going to use 2 sheet pans. And you want to line it with some parchment paper, and on your parchment paper you want to draw or trace a 9-inch cake circle. And you want to have about 3 of these sheet pans ready to go, because what we're looking for is 6 of these all together. Now if you have a really big oven and you can fit two of the 9-inch circles on one sheet pan, that's great. But anyway, I'm going to have to go into the oven at least 3 or 4 times. And you want to make sure to have a few extra circles, because if something happens and they tear or they break or something, you'll have a few extra backup. So all you need to do is just trace a 9-inch cake pan on the bottom or a 9-inch cake circle with pen or pencil. Flip it over so your pen or pencil doesn't get into your cake batter. And then on this side, take a paper towel that's been lightly greased with some pan release or some vegetable oil and just lightly grease the surface of the parchment paper. And that's just for extra security that our cake layer doesn't stick. Okay? Take your cake batter, probably about, let's try this, a little bit more than 1/3 cup. And then using your offset spatula, just smooth it out to about that 9-inch circle size. It can be a little bit under. It's better to be a little bit smaller than a little bit too big. You also want to make sure that it's nice and even. Okay. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but you also want to do a couple 8-inch circles as well. So you want to have 6 9-inch circles altogether, at least 6. And then at least 2 of the 8-inch. You only need 1, but you want to have at least 1 backup because we're going to turn it into a caramel layer. Now I'm going to go ahead and bake this until it's golden, and that should take about 10-15 minutes or so, probably not even that long. And it's a temperature, it's between 380 and 410. Okay, so while our layers bake, we're going to go ahead and make our ganache and our Swiss buttercream, or chocolate Swiss buttercream. The ganache is really, really easy, so we'll make that first. All we need is 8 ounces of chocolate chips. It could be milk chocolate, dark chocolate, semi-sweet, whatever you want. And then 8 ounces of heavy cream. Now I've got 8 ounces of heavy cream coming to a boil on the stove. Okay, once your heavy cream starts to bubble up, go ahead and add that right to your chocolate chips. And just stir until it comes together. Now this is a 1-to-1 ratio. That means equal parts by weight, not by volume, by weight. So 8 ounces chocolate chips and 8 ounces of heavy cream. And this kind of ganache is good for spreading. And if you thin it out a little bit more with some more heavy cream, it's good for glazing as well. Okay, while I'm stirring it together, I'm going to go ahead and add in a splash of dark rum, just for a little bit of extra flavor. Totally optional. You can also use vanilla extract or other kinds of liqueurs if you want. Okay, so our ganache has come together. It's still really, really hot, so it's still really, really soupy. But we're going to let it cool off to about room temperature, and it should get nice and thick and firm and good icing consistency. Okay, our first Dobo layers are coming out of the oven right now. You can see it's a nice golden color. It's a little bit light, and that's because I expect it to cook a little bit longer in the hot sheet pan while it cools off. So it should get a little bit darker. Shouldn't be any darker than this though, or too much darker than this. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit of a trick of how to handle your Dobos Torte layers as they're coming out of the oven. Now, this one got a little bit too dark. This one was closer to the bottom element than the other one I just showed you. But I'm going to keep it just in case something happens. I mean, it's not that bad. But when you take it off, you want to lightly dust it with cornstarch or powdered sugar. I recommend powdered sugar if you don't mind it being too sweet, because I think cornstarch gives it kind of a starchy flavor. Then take your next layer that you're going to remove, flip it over with the parchment paper, with an extra piece of parchment paper, and just peel the parchment paper back. Now that's a nice looking Dobos Torte layer. And I'm going to mark this layer because this is an 8-inch layer. But that's pretty much it. You just keep repeating this as it goes up. And you want to make sure that they're pretty cooled off before you do this, so that way they don't get soggy. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and work on our Swiss buttercream. I still got one more layer coming out of the stove. We're only making a really small batch, and I've got 4 egg whites with 5 ounces of granulated sugar in this bowl. And what we're going to do is we're just going to warm it up over the double boiler until it reaches between 120 and like 130 some degrees. I like to push mine a little bit further than most people. I like to go about 130, 133. And the reason you do this is because you're strengthening your egg whites, which will make a stronger buttercream. What's happening is you're evaporating some water, you're strengthening the proteins in the eggs, and you're also melting out the sugar, or dissolving the sugar a lot better than if you were just to make a regular cold or French meringue. You also want to make sure that your bowl is extra clean by wiping it out with some vinegar. You can do that by dampening a paper towel with a little bit of vinegar. And what that does is it helps clean out your bowl with any fat residue that you might not be able to see but is in the bowl, because any fat is going to keep this, or keep your egg whites from whipping up the way they should when we get to that point. Okay, once your icing reaches at least 120, I went ahead and cooked mine, or warmed mine, to 135. Go ahead and bring it to the mixer and sieve it up on medium-high speed until it reaches about medium to stiff peaks, and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so after about whipping on high for about 3 to 5 minutes or so, you'll see that your meringue will form medium to stiff peaks like this. Notice that it doesn't fall over and it holds its shape pretty well. And that's pretty much when it's ready to go. Alright, so to make it buttercream, we're going to add butter now. We're also going to add a little vanilla extract. And we're going to add 13.5 ounces of unsalted butter. One stick at a time, or if you cut it up into small pieces, you probably add it all at once, however you want to do it. Just incorporate it on low speed until you get all the butter in there. Okay, once you get the butter in there, go ahead and increase it to medium speed until it looks like icing. It'll change its consistency and look like icing, and you'll see, I'll show you what that looks like. This is also the time when you want to add in your flavorings and stuff. You can add it in after you get to the icing consistency, but if I know I'm going to want it to be vanilla, so I'll add it in now. But if you're using a flavor that you're unfamiliar with, you might want to wait until later, so that way you can taste it little by little as you add it in. Now notice that it's actually really soupy looking. It looks like it's ruined. Here, I'll show you. It's just really just watery looking. That's okay. It's just going to take on the consistency of the butter, and while we whip it up, it's going to act like whipped cream. It's going to come together. Now, if you're having an issue with it, for one reason or another not coming together, it's probably because your kitchen or your house is too hot. So stick it in the refrigerator, allow it to cool off, and then whip it up again. Don't let it get solid, like a solid block of butter, but just let it cool off and whip it up again. Usually the reason that buttercream is really soupy, most of the time, I say 99% of the time, is because it's just too hot. As you can see, the buttercream has come together. Now it's still a little bit under whipped, and that's because I'm just going to go ahead and whip it up the rest of the way in a little bit. But right before it gets to this point, it's going to look like it just curdled completely and is ruined. Just keep pushing through it, and you'll get there. Now I'm going to go ahead and add this in, 3.5 ounces of sifted powdered sugar, sifted together with 6 tablespoons of cocoa powder. And usually I only add 3 tablespoons of cocoa powder, but I want my buttercream to be really dark chocolate this time. Okay, once your buttercream comes together, you should have a nice velvety, smooth looking texture. Taste it to see if it's at the flavor level that you'd like. And if it is, we can take it out the mixer and go ahead and use it. Now mine's actually at a good consistency, so I'm going to go ahead and ice with it right away. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and make the caramel layer for our Dobos Torte now. Now this is a little bit of a tricky layer, but if you just follow these steps, you should be able to get it just fine. For the caramel, you want to start off by making basically a simple syrup. So I have got about 7 ounces of granulated sugar and 7 ounces of water with a pinch of cream tartar in this pot, and I brought it to a boil over high heat. And I leave the lid on because what it does is it washes down the sides, and then it helps prevent crystallization, which is important in simple syrup and in making caramel. After it's boiled for like less than a minute, this gives a chance for the water to run down the sides. Take off the lid and allow it to caramelize. Don't touch it, don't stir it or anything like that, just let it go. It's important to remember that when you're putting your sugar and your water in your pot, you run your hands through the water and the sugar to make sure there's no chunks of sugar anywhere, or any clumps of sugar, I guess you could say, in the water, because those will caramelize or burn first and also cause crystallization. Okay, so I've got my 8-inch Dobos cake layer ready to go on a piece of clean parchment paper, no crumbs or anything like that, because you don't want that to get into your caramel. And I also have several tools that have been oiled with vegetable oil. Just dampen it with a paper towel, or dampen the paper towel with a little bit of vegetable oil, and just rub it onto the tools. I got my 2 offsets, a paring knife, and a chef knife. And then once your caramel reaches your desired color, the darker it is, the more caramel, more intense flavor it's going to be. But the lighter it is, the sweeter it's going to be. And I typically like my caramel on the lighter, sweeter side, so I don't let it get that dark. Now this should be enough for 2 8-inch layers. So you probably won't need to use all of it, probably less than half or half of it. But what you need to do, just pour the hot caramel right on top of your layer. And then using your oiled knife or your oiled offset spatula, just push your caramel to the edge of the Dobos layer. Okay, then allow the caramel to cool, and while you're doing that, push off the caramel that got stuck to the parchment paper so that way it doesn't glue your Dobos Torte to the parchment paper. Again, this paring knife is also oiled, so the caramel doesn't want to stick to it too much, hopefully. Okay, and just before the caramel gets too hard, move your layer onto the cleaner side. Place a piece of parchment paper on top. I'm going to use this circle to keep myself from burning myself. Flip the whole thing over. And then quickly cut your circle into 16 pieces. Okay, once all your triangles are cut, flip the whole thing over. And hopefully, not too many of your caramel triangles will have shattered, if any. Mine shattered a little bit, but it's not that noticeable. As it gets colder, it gets really brittle really quickly, so you gotta kind of move quickly on this, and I probably took just a little bit too long to start cutting them. Okay, just making sure all of them are cut. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna place them on my cutting board. I'm gonna place them on my cutting board so they're separate from each other so they don't fuse back together for one reason or another. Now a darker caramel would look more striking, but like I said, I like a lighter caramel in flavor. Okay, now that our caramel layer is done, we can go ahead and start assembling our cake. Take a 9-inch cake circle and put it on top of a turntable with a damp paper towel, and that just keeps the circle from moving around while you're working. We're going to use just a dab of our ganache to glue our first layer in place. Okay, now if you want to use simple syrup to soak the layers to make them a little bit more moist, feel free to. I'm not going to do that because I like them a little bit crispier when it comes to a Dobos Torte. Plus the ganache is going to be very soft. Now if you find that your ganache is just a little bit too runny to work with, go ahead and whip it up on your mixer using the whip attachment, and that'll thicken it up to icing consistency. Or you can refrigerate it. Then taking your offset spatula, just go ahead and spread your ganache. Take your next layer, place it right on top of the ganache, and then repeat. And you want to keep doing this until you've got about 6 or 7, between 5 and 7 of the Dobos layers. Okay, once we have our layers assembled, we can go ahead and ice it just like a regular cake. Now, if you find that your ganache is just a little soft, go ahead and refrigerate it for about 30 minutes to help stiffen it up so that way it's not sliding around while you're icing your cake. So, just start off on the top with about a cup or so of icing. Okay, get this top semi-smooth so that way you can see on what you're working with when you do the sides, but we're going to put more icing on the top and work it in and as we go, so we don't have to be completely perfect, but you do want to make sure that this has enough butter or the right amount of buttercream you're looking for. And just to smooth out the top of the cake, just hold your spatula steady and then work it like a snowplow, like that. But we'll get back to that when we do the sides. So to ice the sides, just want to reach over the cake and then just push your icing onto the side. Use the 9-inch cardboard as a guide. You want to ice it so that way it basically becomes part of the cake so you can't see it anymore. Once you have your sides iced, take your bench scraper or your bench knife and just run it along the edge of the cake. You want to hold it perpendicular to the cardboard so you can press into it so that way you know where it is. But you don't want to lean into your cake. You want to hold it straight up and down because you don't want to have your sides sloping inward. And then when you go around, it'll become really clear where you need more icing. So for example, right here, it should go up like a ring like this onto the top of the cake. If it doesn't, we need more icing on this side. We need more icing here and here. Okay, now you're probably going to have to go back and forth between the top and the sides to get it as smooth as you'd like. But to get rid of the ring, just push it into the center of the cake and then scrape off the extra icing back into your bowl. Okay, and then once you get it to the smoothest that you like, check the sides again, check if there are any air bubbles or anything that you want to patch up, smooth them, smooth the top, and just keep going back and forth until you get it the way you like it. Okay, now the next step is completely optional. If you want to do it, feel free. Here I have some ground up toasted almonds. You can use any nut that you like, but I think almonds are the ones that are more commonly used. And all I'm going to do is just apply them to the side of the cake just by holding my hand steady, well, holding the cake steady, and then bringing my hand around. And they should stick right onto the surface of the cake. Okay, once you have the sides covered to the way that you like, go ahead and place it onto your decorative board using a little bit of icing as glue. Okay, so next we want to divide it up into 16 equal slices. And you can do this by sight, but I really don't recommend doing that. So what you can do is use a long knife, like your serrated knife, and then divide it in half, then in half again, and keep doing it just like the way you did with the triangles. Keep dividing it in half. Alright, and then I'm going to use an 800 Ateco tip. It's a Ateco straight tip. And starting from the middle of the slice that I traced or divided up, I'm going to pipe a tight little curl going from the middle of the slice all the way to the end. And I'm just going to repeat that all the way across the cake. Taking your caramel triangles, lay them onto the coils you just piped so they cover up the division that you drew earlier. So that way they're less obvious. Okay, and then after you finish, you should have this triangle pattern on the top of your cake, but you can still see the division marks in the center of the cake from when we first marked it. So we're just going to take a little bit of the almonds on a spoon and cover that up. Alright, and that's pretty much it. That's your Dobos Torte. Okay, so that's how you make the Dobos Torte. Now, granted, this version is a little bit different from the traditional one, because remember, if he was going to preserve the cake with caramel, he wouldn't really cut it up into triangles, because now it's not really preserving anything. But the buttercream is room temperature stable, so are the cake layers, and so is the caramel. The ganache, on the other hand, isn't really room temperature stable, so I would refrigerate it. Plus, if you refrigerate it, you can get nice, clean slices. Because remember, the ganache is kind of soft, the buttercream is kind of soft, there's many, many layers. It's just going to look like a smushed, creped pancake. But anyway, I hope you learned a lot today. Thank you for watching. Remember, you can download the recipe from my website, www.theauberginechef.com. And remember, the Aubergine Chef, demystifying dessert, one recipe at a time.